Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's special GG+A webinar on the 2013 Giving USA Annual Report on Philanthropy. I'm Anthony Hale from the marketing team here at GG+A, and we're really excited for you all to join us. I hope you all had a chance to scroll through the slides and have a lot of questions for John, Martin, and Donna. Before we begin today, I just want to go over some technical details. We ask that if you can, please log into WebEx before dialing in. Once you launch the webinar, then a window will appear on your screen similar to what you're seeing right now. Then we'll be able to associate your phone number with your name. Next, during the session, your phone will be muted. If you have any questions, please use the chat panel to send them to us so that we can answer them. Please note that we ask that you send your question to all panelists so that John, Martin, Donna, and I can see it and field the question. Also, at the end of the session, we're going to ask everyone to take a 1-minute survey to let us know what you thought of the webinar, so please stick around for that. If at any point during the webinar you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please send me an email at ahoell@grensgleer.com or call our meeting provider, WebEx, directly at 866-229-3239. That's 866-229-3239. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to John, Martin, and Donna.
Donna, why don't you begin this morning?
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Did you expect a response, Donna?
I can hear you, Donna.
I did. I did, but I'm in another country, as you know. So good morning, everyone. I'm glad we have such a huge group on this call. What we're going to do is spend a little bit of time going through 6 or 7 slides, so we'll control the deck for just a little bit amount of time, and then open it up, as John said, for questions about the entire deck. And I know you've all done your homework. So, Anthony, why don't you move ahead to the next slide. Just to remind everybody, Giving USA has been published now for over 60 years, very long, just shy of 60 years, long-lived review of philanthropy in the U.S. It is a summary of giving by Americans to institutions in the U.S., and I make that point explicitly because I know we have friends and colleagues from Canada and the U.K. on the call, so we know this will be useful to you, but it's not comprehensive. I'm going to say just a little bit about methodology.
Hey, Donna. Hey, this is Martin. Maybe you're just going to do it, and I apologize, but would you also convey your historical relationship with this data? Please.
Oh, sure. I have sat on the editorial review board of Giving USA for, I think it's for 12 years now. There are about 15 of us who read sections of the material and send questions and I guess we'd say questions and maybe sometimes quibbles to our friends in Indianapolis, and that's been hugely useful and really educational for me. So thanks, Martin. So our methodology is one of estimation. The estimates are based on data collected by a number of, through a number of sources, primarily through the Internal Revenue Service, looking at personal, corporate, and estate tax data, also looking at surveys conducted by CASE, the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and a set of national sector-specific organizations. It's a process of continual refinement and review, but we're quite confident that it's been durable so far and will continue to be. Anthony, go ahead. Next slide. And the next slide that I want to talk about, just to drive you all crazy, is actually slide 9. And I guess we're going to have to look at these move. The Giving USA folks didn't want us to be tampering with their entire deck. So let's start with this, total giving in 2012, and this tracks giving over the last 40 years. The good news is giving is up 3.5% over 2011. Now, I'm going to express a GG+A point of view, which is that Giving USA always collects data both in current dollars and inflation-adjusted dollars. The current dollars is the line, the gold line. We believe that current dollars are probably more informative for those of us who work as fundraisers. We haven't yet met any donors who adjust their giving to inflation. We don't think that's the way donors think about their giving. So I want you to concentrate on that line. And a couple of points. In current dollars, 2012 is the high point ever in history. And obviously, we had a dip in 2008 and 9, and those are years none of us will forget. But I guess what I'd really like to point out in terms of good news is that even more good news, is that at $316 billion in total giving, that's up from $233 billion 10 years ago and $112 billion 20 years ago. The trajectory is less, the slope is less steep over the last decade than over the previous decade, 1992 to 2002, but it's still strong and good, and I think we should be encouraged by the enormous generosity of Americans and the rebound that we've seen. Now, I'll just make one other point about the $316 billion. This includes 7 documented outright gifts of $50 million or more and 2 bequests of $50 million and more in the Giving USA estimation. I don't think that's the total number of gifts at those levels. I think we'll see a refinement when we go back next year and look again at these 2012 data points. But 9, so 450, it's actually a little bit over 500 because some of them are bigger than 50. 9 gifts of that amount embedded in that 316. Anthony, can you go to slide 17? This is actually like old times because I was trained as an art historian before we had anything electronic. So this slide, total giving as a percentage of gross domestic product, is a good baseline indicator of the level of confidence and giving across the country. At 2% for 2012, we've regained the level of the late 90s. And actually, it's interesting, between 1956 and 1972, it sat directly at 2% consistently through that whole period. Then there was some wavering and then, of course, some buoyancy in the early part of the last decade. But so I think we could say that economic growth outpaced philanthropy slightly in the 70s and 80s, and there's a rebalancing that's been going on in the last couple of years. Anthony, let's go back to 3, please. Okay, so this chart obviously breaks down the 316 by source of contributions, and I'll make just a few comments about this. The foundation figure, the dark blue one on the upper left-hand side of the circle, represents about half traditional foundations and about half personal or family foundations. When you take the sum total of individual giving, bequests, this is all cash, of course, so realized bequests, and family foundations, together they represent 86% of the total giving. That, I think, will track with the experience that most of us have, but it also represents a steady trend upward in the relative weight of individual giving as compared with institutional giving. The corporate giving figure here rose quite sharply over the previous year after it had declined very significantly just after post-2008. But nearly over 2/3 of the corporate giving reported represents in-kind contributions. And the largest sector share represented is pharmaceutical companies. And I guess the only other thing I wanted to say is just a couple basic data points from 2012 about individual giving. 5% of estates include a charitable component, only 5%. That's been consistent over time. I think that represents an enormous opportunity for any of us in terms of increasing the share of our constituents who include our organizations or institutions in their estate plans. And I was interested to learn that the average reported household gift in 2012 was just shy of $2,000, $1,961. 65% of all American households reported charitable gifts, and 95% of high net worth individuals reported charitable gifts. And that's high net worth defined not at the highest level, but at the level of $200,000 or more of family income and $1 million or more of assets, not including the place of residence. I want to go to slide 19, Anthony. Anthony, are you there? There you are. So we're going to look now, the earlier slide was that we looked at total giving in proportion to the gross domestic product. Now we're take a subset, two subsets, and look at individual giving as a percentage of disposable income. The track is similar, but it's a different indicator because this really shows us in the gross, in the aggregate, how confident individual donors are about their own financial situations. We reached a high of 2.4% in 2005. Those are pretty good times for fundraising, as I think you'll all agree. And we've settled back to 1.9%, but we haven't yet reached the level of confidence it appears that we had 5 and 8 years ago. I'll say just, this is, I think, a good time to say that there is a great deal of anecdotal evidence about the impact at the end of December of 2012 of the pending and hypothetical tax law changes, charitable tax law changes. We don't have any real evidence yet. I myself am looking forward to the studies that U.S. Trust and Bank of America always does in terms of surveys with high net worth individuals, but it does seem that some donors at least accelerated either new commitments or pledge payments in the very last part of December, either to get a higher tax deduction benefit than it appeared they might get if they postpone those payments to 2013, and also in some cases just to realize some capital gains and avoid taxes on them. Anthony, can you go to 4 now? We've only got a couple more slides, I promise you. This chart shows total giving in 2012, again, the $316 billion, organized in a different way by recipient organization. Some of these categories are kind of obscure or difficult to interpret, so I'm going to talk you through the definitions of a couple of them that I think will be interesting to you. But to point out, first of all, that once again, religion commanded the largest share of overall philanthropy in the U.S. That share is declining. And it's not declining at a steep rate, but it's a slow, steady rate that's been taking place for at least 30 years. Education and human services each have about the same amount of money. The next greatest shares, I know we have a number of people on from academic medical centers. Gifts to medical centers that are part of comprehensive universities are categorized in this study as education gifts. So it is the type of the primary institution that leads to the categorization. That's an important distinction. 2 comments then just about some headings that may be not so obvious. Public sector benefit is a kind of catch-all, and it includes all gifts to disaster relief. The $21.5 billion that was given last year includes a great deal of the money that was given for the victims of Hurricane Sandy. It also includes gifts to donor-advised funds. Americans gave put over $5 billion in their donor-advised funds in 2012, and that was up 74% over the point of 2010. Of course, in 9 and 10, there was very little of that sort of giving because there were few people with high gains that they wanted to avoid by making that switch. I wanted to just look at international affairs, $19+ billion. That is an area of giving that has, again, that has increased at a steeper slope than some of the others. This only includes gifts to American-based institutions that serve international causes. So if you go on the web and give directly to Médecins Sans Frontières or any of the international non-U.S.-based welfare.
Donna, this is John. Can I interrupt for a minute? There's some background noise going on that's interfering, making it difficult for us to hear you. Is there noise there, or do we have a mic on somewhere?
No, it's not me.
Okay. Go ahead, then.
I don't think it is anyway. Is it better? I heard the crashing,
too. Yeah, it's now stopped. Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So, sorry. Thank you, John. So the international affairs figure does not include gifts made directly to non-U.S. institutions. We know just by anecdote, conversations with many donors, that is a more common practice than it was in the past. I think we're going to have to figure out a way to get at that and measure it in order to understand this fully. And then finally, this really peculiar title, unallocated, nearly $7 billion. That includes a lot of gifts that are made directly to public entities, public schools, your towns and local districts, fire departments, all of that. It's a lot of money, but that's really what unallocated means.
Donna, may I address a question about that chart? Go back to gifts to foundations, $30 billion, the 10%. Can you break that out just for a moment and make a comment about that?
Well, those are gifts to add to or establish personal foundations or family foundations. They're different from that $5 billion to donor-advised funds that's buried in the public society benefit category. So I suppose one way to look at it would be to add that 30 plus and that 5 and say, 35, 36 billion given to secondary giving vehicles directed by individuals.
Thanks. That's exactly what I was looking for. Thank you.
Yeah. I was going to go on and look at a couple of other slides, but I think, we've used 20 minutes of our hour, and I know we have a lot of questions. So maybe we should just open the floor up to our participants.
Let me just add just a couple of this is John Gleer, a couple of quick comments to what Donna has said. I think we have a number of questions coming in. The first I want to say is that I think we've all, in fact, experienced a significant atmosphere post-recession that's been challenging, and it's created many different kinds of pressures on all sorts of nonprofits, from education to culture to public service, human service organizations. It has brought any number of pressures that start with budget constraints across the organizations. And as we've seen, it has had an impact on the nonprofit sector as a whole. We see fewer nonprofits have survived. A number of them have gone out of business. We've seen mergers of nonprofits. We've clearly seen some new thinking in terms of new revenue models, new business models, clearly cost control emphasis that we hadn't seen in the ramp up to our 2007-2008 peak. And in the area of fundraising, we're clearly experiencing from executive leadership and boards the notion of how do we do more with less? How do we get more efficient about what we're doing? There are some large-scale impact issues that we all observe. Symphony orchestras in this country, for example, it is said that 80% or more of them are operating in the red. Financial aid to higher education, as we've watched the higher education cost index climb nearly double the rate of the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, we've noted the pressure on financial aid resources and endowments, and we've seen a great deal of fundraising, not just headed toward endowed funds, but expendable financial aid funds that have changed the way some of our institutions do business. There's a larger issue, however, underlying all of this that we continue to see around the country, and that is a new shift around what had become almost magical thinking about higher and higher campaign numbers, that philanthropy could do everything. And in fact, we're beginning to realize that philanthropy does not fix every problem, that there are revenue issues and human resource issues that have to be addressed in our nonprofits. And we've seen weaker nonprofits go out of business. And we've certainly seen the arts, performing arts, for example, recognize that empty seats simply can't be addressed by raising more money. So that's one large atmospheric issue that's gradually being addressed by some of the growth back that Donna just talked about. I think that it is also important to underscore that while we're not back where we were in terms of inflation-adjusted dollars in 2007, 2008, but we are certainly back in actual dollars. We're still down 8.2%, and it does underscore the fact that it is a slow rise back to where we were. And there's, I think, some estimate from the Giving USA, the Indiana people, that it'll take us 6 to 7 years more of the kind of growth we've had over the last 3 years to get back to the peak that we once reached. Last two issues that I just want to underscore: there has been a reconfiguration of giving over the last decade, over the last 40 years. And when we step back from these numbers, we continue to recognize the long slide in giving to religion, for example, which used to be, I think, peaked at 43, 44% of all giving in this country. This year is at 32%. So that's been a restructuring. Certainly the restructuring that Donna talked about around giving to third-party vehicles, foundations, we see more money in foundations as a resource, and we're down off the peak of individual giving plus bequest giving being 84 or 85% of giving in this country. It now configures differently. Last comment I wanted to make is upward capacity. We continue to be positive and optimistic about where giving is going, given the fact that there are a number of data indicators that, in fact, might get us there, climbing back to a peak of 2.2% of GDP from where we are, or 2.2% of disposable income for where we are right now at 1.9%. Again, basically giving us a sense of confidence that American philanthropy is continuing to climb out of the recession that really hit it hard 4 years ago.
Not to take issue with you, John, this is Martin, but your enthusiasm may be described as a little bit muted. I'm a little bit more enthusiastic in that philanthropy has never been, I think, could be described as a leading economic indicator, but nonetheless, these results are remarkable given that we are not very far removed from the fiscal cliff, that there's all sorts of signs of a painfully slow recovery or a non-recovery, and that the recession was so extraordinarily deep, and what happened during the recession, particularly with regard to large gifts, was pretty cataclysmic. And nonetheless, here we are, bounced all the way back to $316 billion. Is quite extraordinary. And I think it has something to do with something that Donna said earlier. There might have been giving inspired by perceived tax advantage, and something that you said, which is, you know, we've become more and more aggressive about philanthropy, and that's probably what has inspired these healthy numbers in spite of the spotty economy and people's fears and doubts.
Yeah. So let me ask, Martin, you a question, and Donna, perhaps you could comment. We've gotten a question here from Chris Wiseman about trends at the upper end of giving over time. What do the two of you think the Giving Pledge has done to the atmosphere around philanthropy? What kind of impact has that leadership, that group of people had on thinking across American philanthropy?
I think it's had a remarkable impact, and I don't know that the impact has been that remarkable because of the net value of philanthropy of those who have taken the pledge, because there aren't that many, and they have made very significant gifts to their foundations and so forth. But in terms of the impact of their philosophy and the growing notion of making contributions of your wealth and doing something with your estate other than trying to figure out ways to pass it on to your heirs and relatives, and having that become an increasingly popular trend, I think is going to continue to have a significant impact, favorable impact.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that, you know, going back to that interesting point of information that only 5% of estates that go into probate now include any charitable component whatsoever. You know, were we to shift that needle only to 15%, you know, that would make an enormous difference. So having the kind of role modeling that has taken place, I think, is useful, and I think it's particularly useful because it has included very prominent Americans who represent both ends of the political spectrum.
Yeah. So Donna, while you're there, we've had a question about giving to education over the last 10 years. How would you describe it relative to the overall field of giving? And what do you see as a prospect in the coming years?
Yeah, and we can look at page, where is it? Page 26 to look at the data. There's a little drop-down menu, so you don't have to scroll through them all if you don't want to. Giving to education took the most, in the aggregate, took the most dramatic, kind of terrifying fall from 2008 to 2009. Now, that was partly, and I don't have the number at the tip of my tongue, partly because of the extraordinary number of 9-figure gifts that were made, consummated in 2008, most of which went to either universities or university-affiliated medical centers. Remember that their gifts are embedded in this giving to education data. But I think all of the folks who raise funds for educational institutions on the phone are likely to agree that 2009 and 2010 were just really, really tough years, and tough kind of across the spectrum because of challenges that started at the base, at the annual fund, where retention is less reliable, and it was really loss of donors more than the loss of an ability to upgrade donors that we've all been struggling with. So giving to education remains a very strong share, but it seems to have been a little bit more volatile. And I think, and now I'm going to talk anecdotally in terms of the impressions I have rather than strictly based on the data, I think it's in part because the competition is so much stronger and smarter, and because some institutions of education haven't figured out how to help the donor understand what difference his or her gift will make. I think.
Yeah. So let me jump in to Donna and say that you know, if we look at the data around education, I think as a percentage of the overall share, it's drifted lower, largely as a result of the trough, the downturn it took. And a lot of our discussion at that time, several years ago, was around that those dollars went lower because those very large gifts dried up very quickly. That a great many of the largest gifts given to philanthropy do go to education, and it is that big gift area that took such a hit. And it is probably true, and we've seen it anecdotally around the country, that other sectors have moved quickly into the major gift business. Many organizations that have relied upon small gifts and direct response marketing have begun to try to build major gift programs, and we've seen significant gifts to those organizations as well. So it may account for a bit of the drift downward in the education numbers, and And it remains to be seen as we get healthier and we see large campaigns begin to formulate here in the next several years, whether that number changes or not.
Absolutely. If we look at page 34, we can see exactly what you're talking about, John. And one of the interesting phenomena is that you can see here the decline in the percentage of giving to religion that we were describing. That difference hasn't been taken up by this dark blue education sector. It's been taken up by all of these smaller interests at the bottom: environment and animals, international affairs, public society benefit. Those are the ones that have that's where the trade out has been.
Yeah. Donna, any comments about corporate giving and the rise of corporate giving as a percentage of the whole? Clearly, we see as the percentage of individual gifts and bequests have moved from the mid-80s to the mid-70% range, we've seen foundations, and we talked a little bit about where that foundation money is coming. Any comments about corporate giving?
Well, yeah, a couple of comments. I mean, one, just to reiterate, more than half of the reported corporate giving is in-kind giving, and that can include everything from food products to food banks, to pieces of equipment, to, I think those are perhaps the most common kinds of in-kind gifts. Gifts that the institutions represented on this phone call, I scanned the list really quickly this morning, probably don't benefit from all that often. I think for most of our institutions in the U.S., the notion of traditional corporate philanthropy is pretty much an artifact of the past, and that we see our clients working very closely with corporate donors, with really everybody at the table, certainly the corporate philanthropy staff if they exist, but also the marketing staff, and more of a sort of business partnership model or sponsorship model. So the way we do corporate fundraising, I think, is just remarkably different from the way it was even as recently as the 70s and early 80s seem recent to me. They probably don't to everyone, but I think it's changed a lot. And I think that's partly because, of course, corporations are having to monitor their profits very closely, and because there's much more shareholder attention to how the corporate dollars are used.
Let me shift to a different question that we've got and ask Martin to address this particular issue. As we see trustees and leadership of our institutions really concerned about budget constraints and cost control, and really still behaving differently out of this economic downturn, some are arguing that we should actually reduce budgets for development and even keep budgets flat as we get ready for campaigns, cutting our operating resources. Any comments about this, Martin? How do we address this in our institutional environments, even as expectations are growing for more philanthropy and it's harder to make the case for resources to build our programs?
Well, I think the phenomena you described probably relates to certain kinds of institutions, most of which are represented on this call. I think some of those not-for-profits that are so dependent on philanthropy from a day-to-day basis aren't thinking about cutting their budgets much in terms of philanthropic horsepower. I think when trustees start thinking about reductions, if it's trustees as opposed to administrative leadership, it's a failure on our part to educate them to the realities both of the productivity of these programs and the return on investment you get from these programs, and also to our failure to be able to create budget relief out of philanthropy in the ways that will recommend both robust budgets and also the value of these programs. In other words, we aren't converting restricted dollars in a sufficient way to unrestricted dollars to deal with the budget constraints of our institutions.
Donna, let me push a question to you, and I may have a comment as well about it, and that is, we've heard from someone who wants to really understand how emerging initiatives around social entrepreneurship are accounted for in these numbers. Are we seeing any of it show up? Is what they're counting still classified as philanthropy when it intersects with businesses and nonprofits? And are we seeing any of that in higher education, for example?
Well, I think we're seeing it under individual giving. And I also think, thank you to whoever sent this question in, that it's a good question since the Giving USA process, is prepared to take up different topics. That's one that we ought to be taking up more explicitly. So that's the answer to your first question, and it really is only what I think. Are we seeing it in education? We're seeing initiatives in this direction largely at the annual giving or project-based, by which I mean, a gift by a class, that sort of thing, or from members of a class. And I think we're seeing a lot of excitement and enthusiasm. I don't think we're yet seeing the level of dollars that actually moves the needle on any of these big aggregate fronts, but we certainly ought to be paying attention to it. John, you know much more about this than I, but the Europeans are so much farther ahead than the Americans on this front.
Yeah. So I was going to comment, very similar to you, Donna. I believe that we have a shifting definition of philanthropy in this country. It's broadening. We're broadening our thinking about what generates what you would call support or private support to an institution. And we see this at the intersection of research initiatives inside our educational institutions and what might be, old formulas around philanthropic initiatives. We see the research office, in fact, merging with foundation relations and corporate relations. The issue of what classifies as philanthropy, I think, changes even as the notion, the old nominal difference between grants and contracts often was the subject of a lot of discussion. Almost every contract or grant that comes through our doors these days requires stewardship, requires acknowledgement, requires campus visits that our own stewardship staffs are probably best equipped and best skilled to manage, and they often do. So I do think that some of this ground is shifting for us, and we're going to see changes in how our staffs are organized inside of higher education. In terms of social entrepreneurship in many of the million nonprofits that really inhabit almost every community in America, I think we're seeing lots of initiatives from young donors who have made money with innovative business practices coming to their nonprofits, not just with gifts, but indeed with ideas about how that nonprofit can operate more effectively. There's just no question that in the wake of the recession, we saw the loss of upwards of almost 400,000 nonprofits that went out of business that simply couldn't exist because they couldn't raise enough money. There are probably a third to a half of them back, reformulated in different ways in terms of their business operations. And I think we're going to see the impact of young engagement and business engagement around our nonprofits from people who want them to, in fact, act and behave more effectively. Go ahead.
We received a question, is there data or anecdotal evidence about the trends in the mix of restricted, lightly restricted, and unrestricted giving. In my view, first of all, I don't believe there's any data. I'd be interested if you feel the Giving USA data applies here, Donna. But in terms of, I don't think so. The performance of the institutions with which we mostly work, which aren't United Ways, though we work with some, education and healthcare, I don't think there's any trend away from restricted giving. Now, institutions and programs have gotten more artful about figuring out how to raise restricted gifts that can be applied to budget relief or displace otherwise budget dollars, but I don't think the percentages are changing even minutely.
Yeah, the only data I know that gets at this but is not precise, doesn't precisely answer this, is the data collected by CAE about higher education and a reasonable number of independent schools. And that is the mix year to year of the gifts allocated to program support, endowment, and facilities. And what is true consistently over the last 40 years is that in every period of recession, the percentage of giving to facilities drops from about 14% to about 11% in the aggregate. Every single recession, it's interesting. And it's shifted over to program support, so to spendable money. The percentage to endowment stays quite steady, but I think that's a little bit of a misleading point because, of course, so many bequests go to endowment, and we can't control whether those are realized in a recession or not. So it doesn't quite answer the question, but it is related.
I would add, Donna, that I think that it's possible to look hard at annual fund structures across higher education, for example, and know that they're adapting to the notion that when a donor feels a sense of impact or purpose around their gift, they give more. And that the past notion of the kind of the purity of annual funds, of totally unrestricted giving, has really given way to allowing donors to make choices. And we create all sorts of choices, some of them very wide, diverse, and complex, some of them very simple. But what we're doing anecdotally, and I think there's interesting evidence that we could look at that suggests that what we learn from donors we're putting into practice in terms of our fundraising activities and focusing far more on seeking gifts that are designated or restricted in some way, thereby delivering greater donor satisfaction. I don't think we're going to see really strong, unrestricted funds, despite the fact that many of our organizations, cultural organizations, depend upon that unrestricted support to deliver their performances, to deliver to their mission. Even in those environments, we're looking for new ways to package and define that support around areas that donors have particular interests in. So I think it is shifting ground for all of us as we think about how we motivate our donors to give more and to sustain their giving.
Right, and I agree absolutely, and I think one of the most challenging situations can be one in which longtime volunteer leaders are, to a certain extent, disdainful of the way the newer generations of donors like to make their gifts. It's not a helpful conversation.
Yeah. So let me ask Martin this question. Is it a good time for a campaign right now? What do you say to clients right now as they think about campaigns as a way to help grow themselves out of some real, some financial and budget pressures as they begin to see philanthropy in complex ways driving a key piece of their agenda in the future?
Well, our position always has been in the firm, John, as you know, that the economy probably isn't and should not be a primary factor in driving a campaign timing decision, campaign embarkation decision, though you might adjust announcements and other things based upon what's happening in the economy. Having said that, is the economy more favorable to the campaign than has been the case historically? I think there's a lot of indicators that it's pretty favorable. One is this recovery in large gifts, and those institutions obviously that succeed in campaigns succeed, particularly at the high end of the gift pyramid. Secondly, if you look at the performance of campaigns in higher education, for example, in America, and if you look at the billion-dollar campaigns, none of them, with the possible exception of one, I think there are 43, are in any kind of jeopardy of not making their goal within the time frame that they anticipated. I would also say the giving challenge helps. So there's a lot of factors. This data is encouraging. I think it's an excellent time from an economy point of view to be in a campaign or moving into a campaign.
Let me pose a question to Donna and Martin that just came in. Very thoughtful question. Is there any data surrounding whether or not donors overall in the U.S. are satisfied with the results achieved by not-for-profits? And if not, shouldn't we be beginning to do surveys and surveying donors to check on their satisfaction with us? Thanks, Chuck, for that question.
Martin, unless you want to start, I will go first. I think the best data to get at that question is the biennial Bank of America survey of high net worth individuals. It is more and more interesting, I think, now that it's been in place for a number of years. And my recollection is that the most recent one, which was published in 2012, and you can find it either on Bank of America's website or on GG+A's website, shows that understanding the impact of gifts, their previous gifts, is one of the primary causes or motivators for continued giving by high net worth individuals. And the inverse is that a lack of confidence that previous gifts have been used well is one of the most highest reasons that high net worth donors choose not to renew their support to
Donna, I agree with you. That's the only data that comes to mind, and it really doesn't address the question in the way that it was asked. Interestingly, a lot of you out there, and sometimes with our help, do donor satisfaction surveys of various types within institutions to determine how well we're doing and what is the perception of the quality of our stewardship and our relationship management. But it's an interesting question. Should we do more from a industry point of view, from a national perspective, to understand the sentiments of donors and how well we're treating them in terms of the not-for-profit infrastructure?
Right. Right.
We have another question. Comment about the connection between volunteering and giving. Any indication that this correlation is getting stronger, changing in any way? Let me begin on that. First of all, the data in this deck reveals that volunteerism remains low, or lower than it has been. And Donna, you might explain where that comes from. I think those are very broad spectrum volunteers.
Right, they are. They are. That includes, everybody from docents in cultural institutions and people who sit at desks at hospitals to high-level board membership. It's very broad.
But it is concerning in that we of course know that volunteerism occasions engagement, and engagement occasions philanthropic behavior. Again, looking at that Bank of America survey, it has indicated that, first of all, high net worth individuals give more when they volunteer more. That's absolutely clear in that data. And secondly, that volunteerism, the trend in volunteerism amongst high net worth individuals is favorable, that they are increasing their levels as a percentage of the total population rather significantly. And it's quite high. I think it's in the 70-some percentile. So I think there is a trend with high net worth individuals to volunteer, whether they volunteer in campaigns or not, in a campaign leadership role. That's another question.
Right,
You know,
and some of this drop in the overall volunteer rate in 2010 and 11 has to do with the fact that the number of Americans who stayed in the workforce in those years because the value of their retirement funds had declined so precipitously. So, for people who made a complete switch historically from paid employment to volunteer employment, there seems to be a little bit of a lag.
Yeah, one of the things I would underscore about what Martin just said is every public survey that we know reinforces this issue, that even if you volunteer a single hour, there's a push upward of your giving. And, the Bank of America, U.S. Trust studies have shown that. Some independent sector studies have shown that. And it's been all over the map in terms of the data that's been acquired, but pretty conclusively the data really underscores that issue. Those who volunteer their time give more money. Based upon that premise, we work with a group of about 14 or 15 leadership educational institutions where we took a particular look at giving within their institutions of higher education relative to alumni giving and non-alumni giving and volunteering, both volunteering amongst non-alumni and alumni. And what was surprising to us was how emphatically that work underscored the truism of the operating principle that we've always operated on, volunteers give more. It was astonishingly evident in this data, and it ranged, according to institution, anywhere from a volunteer in the same age group giving somewhere between 12 to 19 times more money than a non-volunteer. Now, interestingly enough, in that same data, we found the same behaviors characteristic of non-alumni as alumni. So it was very interesting how it reinforced what has really been an operating principle for us in many campaigns. There's no question that when we formulate voluntary leadership for campaigns, we are focused on their leadership giving. And that volunteer piece has been a driver in defining goals and indeed driving larger goals into many of the campaigns that we've worked with. Other questions? Donna and Martin, would either of you care to comment on the notion that administrative cost is the wrong measurement for evaluating efficiency and effectiveness of a nonprofit?
Well, I'm not sure what the definition of administrative cost is. If administrative cost means advancement cost, it's certainly the wrong measure, though I do think there has to be parameters that we have failed to establish, quite frankly, in our industry that say that these costs are out of control relative to the production. And we don't have standards to that effect which should help guide us, but we need them. If administrative cost means elsewhere in the organization, I'm not qualified to comment on that.
Donna, any comments?
Well, I think that the historical value methodology of looking at cost on the dollar in terms of the actual expenditure on development operations compared to the cash received in a specific 12-month period is inadequate. I mean, the only type of organization that could be somewhat informative about would be one that was limited its fundraising to direct mail and events-based fundraising, and even those might span a fiscal year. So I think that one of the things we need to do is educate volunteer leaders and actually executive management about a couple of other approaches. I mean, one is certainly a 3-year rolling average, which just takes the same methodology and extends it. And the other is to talk really seriously about net yield and the fact that if we do a responsible job of understanding what the upper limit of any institution's potential is for philanthropy, that we should be staffing towards that potential and talking about what the net result will be for the institution, so that it may be better to spend 20. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so let me emphasize that what Donna's just said. I think rather than the cost to raise a dollar, our institutional leaders are looking at this issue that Donna just raised of net yield. That is, if it costs us 16 cents to raise a dollar instead of 11 cents, but by spending that extra 4 cents and investing the money, we're bringing 30 or 40 or 50 million dollars more to the institution to support its mission, then we're probably doing the right thing. And we know that there are wide disparities in costs, particularly amongst academic healthcare institutions. Those that report 11 cents, 10 or 11 cents, and those that report double that or 20 or 21 cents. This is well documented. And the issue is what's different and what are the institutions trying to achieve by those kinds of investments?
Though more often than not, those disparities relate to how they count their costs than a disparity in productivity.
Right. But interestingly enough, we also see some institutions choosing to spend more dollars on stewardship and are counting fully those costs in their numbers. We're getting close to the end, and I wanted to go back to a couple of questions just to get Martin and Donna to comment on them. One is, should we, as organizations, as nonprofits raising money, spend more time talking to and surveying our donors to understand how they feel about their giving, whether in fact their giving they feel has the impact. In other words, doing the kinds of stewardship follow-up and surveys that would suggest we'd learn more from them. Should we be doing that? Are we doing enough? Do we understand enough what motivates our donors?
Donna, I'll go first and say yes.
Go ahead.
And yeah, I'll also say I think we should be doing not only surveys amongst our donors, I think we should be doing surveys with our internal customers, our internal constituents. At the university, for example, our deans and some of our faculty to find out their levels of satisfaction with their participation in the philanthropic process.
Right, or physicians or curators or whomever are programmatic.
Exactly.
Clients are, and I thought you were headed in a different direction. We should certainly be surveying more often with some combination of face-to-face and phone and web-based, all the different channels. And we ought to be surveying our non-donors, too, particularly non-donors that used to be our donors or that we believe have high capacity and have turned elsewhere. We simply need to know more, and I think too many institutions get on a little bit of a gerbil wheel and guess what their donors think rather than asking them.
We're pretty close to the end of our time. Let me make one comment here that picks up something that both Martin and Donna talked early on in our discussion about. That is our optimism going forward. It was 5-6 years ago when I know a number of us were talking about the problem of how do we get American philanthropy, giving as a percentage of GDP, finally up from its stall around 2 to 2.2% of GDP. How do we motivate the American public to give at 3% or 4% or even 5% across the board? I mean, that was an interesting discussion, and it occasioned a lot of public discussion about what might motivate broader giving in America. Today, post-recession, we're sitting at somewhere around 2% of GDP, talking about how do we get back to that peak period of 2.2%. I think many of us who've been in this business for a long time do feel fundamentally optimistic about philanthropy in this country, and optimistic about some of the institutions out there that have been, in fact, quite powerfully competent at defining their case for philanthropic support and seeking it. We want to thank everyone for their participation today. Clearly, we're interested in feedback and additional questions if you have them. I want to thank my colleagues, Donna Wiley and Martin Grenzebach, for being with me on this call today, and thank all of you for being with us. We appreciate it. Thanks.